Hello and welcome to this video lesson. First thing I'd like to say is about editions that you're playing from with this piece. If you're using the Segovia edition or one that's derived from that, I really would suggest that you get yourself one of the other modern editions of the complete studies, such as the Chanterelle or the Tecla books. Not least because if you do that, then you have access to all the other studies that he wrote and not just Segovia's selection. If you're using an early 90s edition of the Tecla, I'd point out there's a bad mistake in the second bar. The bass note should clearly be a G and not an F. Now, when we look at a piece called Study or Etude, clearly one of the first things to do is to establish what it is the piece is a study in. What technical or mechanical routines does it present to us that we have to address? Quite often you might look at a study and it is obviously a study in arpeggios or in slurs or in scales or some other mechanical thing that we have to practice and that the piece wants us to do. With a piece like the one we're addressing here, that's actually quite a complicated question, and the reason is that this piece is the best example, and certainly the best known, of a variety of piece where this composer takes a model from outside of the world of the guitar. One thing to remember is that Fernando saw more than most other composers for the guitar, spent most of his time writing for other things. So he wrote a lot of music for voice and for orchestra, and relatively little really for the guitar. And what he has done here, he has taken a model which is that of a three-part vocal composition, quite possibly like a motet. He quite often wrote motets to sacred Latin texts. And so clearly what we're looking at here is a piece where we are required to play it in a style and with a technical effect that sounds like and gives the same musical idea as would happen if we were listening to something actually being sung by three voices. And if you listen to this kind of vocal music, you will notice that the effect is very legato, very smooth. Each voice is very distinct and individual. Basically, this means that these are the qualities that we need to reproduce on the guitar. Now, if you look at the first bar of the piece, you'll see that it's three chords in crotchets or quarter notes. And it's very easy when you play the guitar, and perhaps especially if you come to it from a playing chords background, to think of each chord as a vertical stack of notes, like three pebbles piled on top of each other. But of course, now that we're thinking of this as being for three separate voices, rather than vertical stacks, we have to think of three voices travelling along the line, horizontally, travelling from left to right. And this gives a completely different feel to how we play the instrument. And in particular, when you're thinking of the question of legato, remember that there are basically two things you have to do to achieve legato. Firstly is that your right hand must not plant on the strings one moment sooner than is required. Secondly, you have to keep the left hand fingers on for the full duration of the note and not plant any new chord earlier than is required, because every time you do either of those two things you will stop the sound. So for example, with the first three chords, obviously the first one is nice and easy because that's coming from nowhere, but as soon as I play the second one, if I put my right hand back on one moment too soon, I'm starting to put a break in between the chords. Obviously I'm exaggerating the breaks there. And so throughout this piece you've got the same issue to face, that every time you either move a left hand shape or prepare to play, especially when you're playing repeated chords on the same strings with your right hand, to avoid chopping the sound off any sooner than is strictly required by the fact that you do have to pluck the string in order to play the instrument. The other thing to be clear about, because we're thinking of this in this vocal style, is that really probably every single chord of the piece, and certainly almost all of them, have to be played together and not arpeggiated, not rolled. So to hear the three separate voices as singers would do them, each chord is together rather than, because it would be a very rubbishy choir if they actually sang like that. Now you can argue that there may be occasional chords, especially those which have particular dissonances in them, that it can be helpful to slightly break them, and that can be true. And of course you can take this idea of the vocal model too far. You still remember that you are actually playing a guitar and not three people singing. But nonetheless, the overall feel really has to be that you're playing the chords together all the time. Now we're going to look at some specific instances of things we have to do. Notice that the first chord in the second bar and similarly in the fourth bar is a dissonant chord. And one of the most important things to aim to do in this piece, and this is a particularly difficult thing to do, is to be prepared to bring out particular voices. This is particularly difficult when the voice we have to bring out is the middle one. For example, the C on the first beat of the second bar. Your first bar leads up to it, and the C becomes a clash which resolves onto the B on the second beat. That's a very common process. It happens quite a lot in this piece. It happens in many places in this composer's works and elsewhere. It's a very important process to notice, because then you can engage with what's happening and play it intelligently. As I say, there are many places where we have to bring out particular voices. Overall, you're looking for quite an even sound where all the voices are relatively equally heard, but sometimes one voice will want to come out into particular prominence. Now, one thing you might notice is actually fairly normal about the way Sor has written this piece, is that a lot of the time, as in the first bar, you have two voices in the higher register, a third apart, 3 notes apart, as in C, D, E, supported by a bass line. And clearly here he's looking for a more together, sort of euphonious kind of sound. That texture does quite often split apart. That raises one little question that you have to decide upon in bar 7, 8, 9, 10. In the very first edition of this piece, that chord had a B on top. And of course, having a B on top, it keeps those top two voices going, rather than sort of amalgamating them into a unison G. Now, in one sense the G does make a little bit more sense, but as I say, keeping the B on top keeps those two voices separately, and it was in that first edition. So in general I do prefer to play it, but it's a little bit of a complicated question. We can't address it too much here.